In the stillness of a moonless night in the year of our Lord 1326, the wind moved through the alleyways of Avignon like a whispering priest, intimate, uninvited, and full of secrets. The papal city was dressed in velvet black, save for the flickering of distant torches and the low moan of a monastery bell that tolled not for time, but for sin. You see, in Avignon, time wasn't measured by hours or seasons. It was measured in confessions and blood. This was not Rome. Rome had been abandoned like a crumbling altar. The Pope had taken his throne across the Alps, and the papal court now perched like a fat spider in the papal palace in southern France. From here, Pope John XXI ruled, a man with eyes like dying embers and hands that never touched anything without gloves. He had once been a money changer's son. Imagine that, the vicar of Christ, God's voice on earth, once running fingers over copper coins and silently judging the weight of silver. Some say the smell of money never quite left him. Others say either did the smell of fear. And fear, in 1326, had a name. Whispers carried it through convent walls and beneath marble floors. They called her Sora Vita, Sister Life. A name so ironically cursed that it made demons chuckle. A nun, they said, heavy with child. Cloistered, silent, her belly right beneath a woolen habit stitched by the same hands that once held rosaries. The scandal was not her sin. Sin was expected. In Avignon, sin walked with the bishops and slept in the same sheets. No, the scandal was what happened to her after. She disappeared. No burial. No mention. No prayer. And worse, she was not the only one. The papal records, bound in oxblood leather and sealed with wax thick as a thief's tongue, held no mention of it. Of course they didn't. You don't write dismemberment into church history. You whisper it. You carve it into the backs of walls. You bury it under 1,000 white lies wrapped in Latin. But still, it found its way out. It always does. Let us go back. Further than 1326. Let us sit beside the flickering candlelight in the chambers of a young Jacques Duys, the boy who would become Pope John XXI. The year is 1250. He is small and clever, barefoot, with 2 large ears and a too sharp tongue, wandering the limestone alleys of Cahors, south of France, darting between market stalls while the smell of salted fish clings to his tunic. His father, Arnaud, was a merchant of the baser kind, dealing in debts and teeth-grating bargains. His mother, a woman with eyes like chipped chalices, died giving birth to her 7th child. Only Jacques survived. There was no prophecy. No choir of angels singing in the rafters. Just a skinny boy with ambition stuck in his ribs like a second heart. He wasn't devout. He was strategic. While others knelt in prayer, Jacques read law. When others memorized hymns, he memorized who owed whom, and what silence cost in a noisy world. He climbed the ladder not on grace, but calculation. Archdeacon, bishop, cardinal, and then, by some sick miracle, pope. Not everyone celebrated. France saw an opportunity. The church saw a pawn. Jacques, now John XXI, saw a throne. Avignon in the 1320s was not holy. It was luxurious, perfumed with indulgence and rot. The papal palace rose from the banks of the Rhone like a sanctified fortress. Silk-clad cardinals held feasts while peasants bled in the fields. Virgins prayed to saints who had been bought and sold. Wine flowed faster than water, and the walls heard everything. It was here, within these velvet-draped catacombs of power, that the first whispers arrived. A nun, perhaps from the Benedictines. Maybe the Dominicans. They kept it vague. The name changed with each telling. But always, she was pregnant. Impossible, they said. These were women of God. But flesh is weak. And locks are only as good as the hunger of the hands that test them. One version claimed a stable boy. Another, a priest. Still another, that the devil himself entered the cloister disguised as a handsome novice. What matters is not who. It's what was done after. John XXI summoned no council. He issued no public edict. He simply nodded once, slow and thin-lipped, as a trusted man in a crimson robe whispered the sin in his ear. Find them all, the Pope said, and silence them. The Vatican employed many holy offices, but none were holier or quieter than the Fratres Silence, the Silent Brothers. A clandestine order so secret even most cardinals denied its existence. They didn't wear robes. They didn't chant. They didn't speak. They removed problems. And to them, pregnant nuns weren't sinners. They were loose ends. In the convent of St. Agnes, nestled among vineyards and unmarked roads, the sisters rose for lauds at dawn. The air was clean there, pure in a way that almost mocked the filth of the world outside. They scrubbed floors, whispered psalms, and boiled roots into medicines for the nearby villages. But one sister no longer came to prayer. Her name was Sister Marriott. She had soft hands and sad eyes. A farmer's daughter, joined the cloister at 14 after her mother caught her with a traveling piper behind a haystack. At first, she seemed pious, but her belly swelled in winter, and the Mother Superior's smiles turned to steel. They locked her away, not for the scandal, not for the sin, but for the message it sent. God was not mocked, especially not on papal land. The Silent Brothers arrived under cover of darkness. 4 of them. Faces shadowed by traveling hoods, boots soundless on stone. They brought no tools. They used what they found. A sharpened chalice stem. A piece of altar marble. The blood, they said, did not scream. It wept. They buried her in the convent's own garden, beneath the rosemary and thyme, places meant to remind the living of peace. But the earth does not forget. And the flowers grew taller that spring. This happened not once, not twice, but again. In Lyon, in Narbonne, even in distant Florence. The same story. A sister gone missing. A locked room. A midwife bribed to look the other way. The Pope's hands stayed clean. Officially. Unofficially, he signed letters with the briefest scrawl. Fiat voluntas Dei. Let God's will be done. But it wasn't God's will. It was his. Inside the papal palace, rumors became currency. Servants passed them like notes between laundry baskets. A cook overheard a confession. A scribe found blood on a papal decree. A cardinal, drunk and weeping after a feast, muttered, "They cut out the child still breathing," before collapsing onto the floor. These things happened in shadows. But shadows lengthen. And one nun survived. Or so the tale goes. Her name was Sister Domitilla, from the convent of St. Euphemia. They said she escaped through the cloister cistern, bleeding and barefoot, carrying something small and wriggling wrapped in her own veil. A child. A daughter. She was never found. But sometimes, in the hills of Provence, the peasants spoke of a woman with ink-stained hands who taught their children to read Latin. She never aged. She never prayed. And every year, on the feast of St. Agnes, she left rosemary on the church steps, wrapped in papal parchment. Now, dear listener, we find ourselves in a room thick with incense and heavy with velvet. The Pope sits at his desk, hunched and gray, scribbling treatises against heresy while his private guards wash blood from their boots. Outside, a storm gathers. Not of thunder. Of memory. Because sins do not die quietly. Not even when buried beneath marble. They wait. They breathe. And sometimes, they come bearing names. Rain in Avignon does not fall. It creeps. It begins as a mist that softens the stone and curls the corners of parchment, then thickens into something that sinks into robes, hair, and memory alike. In such weather, the streets become echoes, the kind where footfalls do not land so much as hesitate. It was on such a day that a letter arrived at the papal palace. No seal. No signature. Just 3 words in an unsteady hand. "She is alive." The scribe who opened it assumed it a madwoman's scribble. The papal secretary who received it assumed it blackmail. But John XXI, still sharp despite 70 winters, read it once, paused, and then had it burned. Not torn. Not filed. Burned. Because he knew exactly who she was. Let's leave the papal palace now. Let's travel north, to the wind-scoured plains outside Dijon, to a half-forgotten priory built by Templar gold and neglected by memory. Its cloisters were cracked. Its roof bowed like a sinner's spine. But within it, tucked behind a rusted iron gate, was a tiny library no wider than a shepherd's hut. And it was there, among worm-bitten manuscripts and half-saints sketched in ink, that Sister Domitilla, once hunted, now taught. She had taken another name, of course. Sister Aveline. A name like a puff of air, soft and hollow. She wore no habit, only plain gray wool. She taught not the catechism but grammar. Not the Psalms, but how to write letters to faraway sons. Her students were girls with cracked knuckles and calloused hands, daughters of stablemen and bakers, girls who had never known a Latin verb or a clean slate. She never mentioned where she came from. Never told them why she walked with a limp or kept her left wrist bound always in linen. But once, a curious child asked, "Why don't you wear the cross, sister?" Aveline smiled. "I carry it inside me." And indeed she did. In the pit of her belly, beneath a line of scars, was the memory of a crucifix dropped on stone during a long-ago night when she bled beside rosemary bushes and whispered, "Live, please live." Back in Avignon, John XXI was not well. His physician, Brother Eligius, called it the shaking sickness. His enemies called it the devil's debt come due. The Pope's hands twitched during Massachusetts. He soiled his own vestments. And at night he called for his long-dead mother, whispering in Gascon dialect the same phrases over and over. "Tell her not to name me. I was God's mouth." They were already damned. His confessor, Father Odric, dutifully scribbled it all down. But even Odric, devout, obedient, and dull as raw bread, began to wonder. So he did what good men do when they're afraid of answers. He searched. And what he found was this. A scroll, wrapped in wax cloth, tucked behind a beam in the Vatican's auxiliary archives. Its edges were singed, as though someone had tried to burn it but lost courage midway. It read, "Convent of St. Euphemia. Knight of St. Lucy. Orders carried. One missing. Witness fled. Blood not confirmed. Infant presumed expired. Recommend silence and reburial of other remains." There were no names. No signatures. Just a final stamp. SB. Silent Brotherhood. Odric dropped the scroll. His hands trembled. But it was not the content that terrified him. It was the wax seal. He'd seen that same pattern just once before, on a private letter the Pope had locked in an iron chest lined with lead and holy water. From here, the past spilled into the present like wine onto altar linen. Because the truth is this, history rarely hides. It waits. And Domitilla's story was not finished. The girl she bore was called Isabeau. A name with no saint. A name given in silence, by candlelight, as Domitilla smeared mud on the child's forehead in the shape of a cross and whispered, "I do this not to damn you, but to keep you forgotten." Isabeau was raised among books and shadows. She never attended Massachusetts. Her mother taught her herb lore, Greek declensions, and how to find the shape of a lie in the folds of a priest's robe. By the time she was 17, she could speak 4 languages and had copied by hand the entire Confessions of St. Augustine, not because she believed, but because she wanted to argue. But she was restless. Angry in the way that only the children of silence are. And when a traveling scholar named Père Lucien came through the priory, she did what daughters often do, she left. Not with kisses. Not with tears. Just a note, wedged into the folds of her mother's teaching robes. "If they hunted you, they should know what your blood can become." Domitilla wept. Not from betrayal, but from dread. Because she knew exactly where Isabeau was going. To Avignon. To the belly of the beast. Let us pause here, not for breath, but to remember the feel of parchment beneath fingers. The weight of ink. The heat of secrets buried beneath marble. Isabeau arrived in Avignon in the spring of 1343. The Pope was Friar now, propped by pillows and pride. But the court still moved around him like planets around a fading star. Bishops haggled. Scribes gossiped. Quibus whispered sins for coin. Isabeau entered as a copyist. A minor post. Anonymous. Ideal. She wore spectacles. She said little. She drank bitter wine and stayed late. Within 3 months, she had access to the papal archive. Within 6, she had read the names of every convent execution under John XXI's seal. She memorized them. And then, she began to write. Not scrolls. Not letters. But a book. She called it, The Womb and the Sword, a reckoning of daughters buried in prayer. It named names. Described deaths. Even included sketches, rough, emotional things, more angry than accurate. And when she was done, she made 20 copies. By hand. Then smuggled them out. One to Paris. One to Florence. One to a monastery in Wales. One, they say, to a Moorish prince who paid for it in sapphires. The last copy, she placed on the Pope's own chair during the evening Mass. He sat on it. And when he rose, white-faced and leaking urine, he clutched it to his chest and whispered. She was supposed to be dust. Isabeau disappeared the next day. Some say she was caught. Others, that she boarded a ship for Egypt under a false name. But one thing is certain. The book survived. It was banned, burned, anathematized. But it survived. And with it, the memory. The Pope died 2 weeks later. Not from poison. Not from dagger. From fright. He died whispering the names of women he had never met but had ordered torn apart. And in the archives, beneath a floorboard near the scriptorium, a final message was found, written in a hand not unlike his own, but less steady. God sees the womb. Man sees the shame. I buried them both. Forgive me. But forgiveness, you see, is not archival. It is personal. And sometimes it is inherited. Long after Pope John XXI had rotted into memory, and his bones sealed beneath gilt marble in Notre Dame de Dames, the air in Avignon did not change. It remained thick, cloying, like a woolen shroud too damp to discard. Some places do not move on, they digest history and let it fester in silence. The year was 1379. A new pope, or rather 2 popes, now claimed Peter's throne. It was the time of the Great Schism, when even God's house was cracked down the middle like an overripe fig, oozing piety from both ends but rotting all the same. In Rome, Pope Urban VI. In Avignon, Pope Clement VII. 2 vicars of Christ. 1 papacy. And enough corruption to poison every cathedral from Scotland to Sicily. But under that battle of mitres and bulls, another fire smoldered. A quieter one. The book. The Womb and the Sword. By now, it had a life of its own. No one knew the author's true name. Some claimed she was a Jewish convert. Others, a disgraced abbess. A few whispered that it was written by a ghost. One of the butchered nuns returned in ink. Monasteries banned it. Bishops cursed it. But monks copied it in secret, word by word, their faces pale in candlelight, as if afraid the parchment itself might scream. And still it spread. In Strasbourg, a tailor's wife was whipped for reading it aloud in the marketplace. In Milan, it was nailed to a bishop's door. In Barcelona, it was bound in red leather and passed from midwife to midwife like a holy relic. It became more than a book. It became a wound. And wounds, if not lanced, fester. Now let us step into the quiet world of a scribe named Guillaume of Vienne. He was not a rebel. He was not brave. He liked onions, short walks, and bad jokes about friars. His hands were stained with ink and chicken grease in equal measure. He copied papal decrees by day and read romances by night, sighing too loudly whenever a knight did something noble. But one night, while rummaging through discarded scrolls in the papal library's condemned archives, he found a page. Just one. Torn. Charred on one edge. It read, "And the child, crowned in blood and rosemary, shall carry the memory of every sister whose breath was stopped not by sin, but by shame." He thought it was poetry. Then he found the second page. And the third. He did not sleep that night. And by morning, Guillaume had changed. Within a month, He had recopied the entire womb and the sword manuscript, embellishing it with illuminations of women not with halos, but with open wounds, golden, divine, and bleeding truth. He bound the copy himself. And he sent it, carefully, with coin and silence, to Prague. There, it found the hands of Queen Anne of Bohemia. And everything shifted. And was no fool. A reader. A patroness of letters. And perhaps most dangerous of all, a woman who listened. She had grown up under bishops who smelled of sweat and boys. She knew what monasteries hid and what convents endured. So when she read the manuscript, she did not weep. She wrote. To other queens. To abbesses. To noblewomen whose names history would forget but whose power and whispers could crack empires. And suddenly, in the year of our Lord 1381, nuns across Europe began asking questions. Small ones at first. Where is Sister Beata buried? What happened to the infant of Sister Gertrude? Why does this convent's record end midwinter? Then bolder. Who ordered the silence? Why was there no investigation? Why does the Holy Father fear women's flesh more than men's daggers? Avignon, already crumbling beneath the weight of a counterfeit papacy, began to sweat. Cardinals began, accidentally, choking during banquets. Archives were mysteriously lost to fire. A nun in Bordeaux was found drowned, her feet weighted with rosaries. The message was clear. Forget. But women do not forget. Especially when the forgetting is ordered. Let us return to Domitilla, whose bones now lay beneath a wild apple tree outside the ruins of St. Euphemia. She died as she lived, quietly. Alone. With a book hidden beneath her bed and a lock of hair that no one ever saw her touch. But her daughter, Isabeau, had left a mark so deep that it began to echo. And in one distant convent, high in the Alps of Savoy, a girl named Therese stumbled upon one of the hidden manuscripts. She was young, burned with questions, and she saw in those pages not just rage, but purpose. So she copied it, in her own hand, and beneath it signed, I am the daughter of daughters, and I will be the voice of those buried without hymns. That copy was found 200 years later in a French seminary attic. They called it heretical. Then they filed it under apocryphal accounts. But still, it was read. And still, it was believed. Because belief, once seated in suffering, grows not like wheat, but like ivy. Uninvited, tenacious, and utterly unwilling to die. By the turn of the 15th century, the story had spread so far and so silently that even the Vatican could not pretend it hadn't heard. Pope Martin V, newly seated after the schism's bitter end, was handed a dossier concerning the disappearances of certain conventuals under Pope John XXI. It was thick. Too thick. Compiled by a nun. Signed simply. Via. Not a name. Not even a vowel. Just Latin. The way. They tried to suppress it. But it was already too late. Because the story had now become not just a record of the past, but a map. In the streets of Florence, women gathered in wine cellars, reading the tale aloud like liturgy. In Krakow, a novice tore her habit in two, whispering, My womb is not shame. In Canterbury, a monk painted a mural of pregnant saints, each with a child cradled in one arm and a sword in the other. And in Paris, scrawled across the door of a Dominican priory in red chalk, They bled so you could speak. Speak. The Pope ordered silence. The women answered with choruses. The Vatican has never truly feared armies. Armies it could excommunicate. Kings it could outlast. Even heretics it could burn. But stories? Stories are another matter. You cannot threaten a story. You cannot bribe it, torture it, or tie it to the rack. You cannot bury it in consecrated ground and expect silence. Because a story, especially one born in blood and whispered through centuries, becomes a kind of liturgy all its own. A counter-gospel, written not in gold leaf but in the shadows between cloister walls. And by the 15th century, the story of the dismembered nuns had grown teeth. It no longer lived in parchment alone. It lived in memory. in song, in the uneasy glance of a novice when a bishop entered the room too softly. And it lived in the mirror, because some women began to look at themselves not as brides of Christ, but as heirs to those who had been silenced, wombs not as vessels of shame, but of power once punished. Let us turn now to Rome. The real Rome. The Rome that had survived schism and rot, where the papal court returned after Avignon and tried to pretend the exile had been a hiccup in God's plan, not a century-long confession of corruption. In 1438, a curious decree made its way quietly through the halls of the Lateran. De Custodia Conventum et Ordinis. On paper, it called for stricter protection of cloisters, greater supervision of visitors, regular inspections by male confessors. But beneath its Latin lace and passive voice was a blunt aim. Stop the copies. The womb and the sword, by now, had gone from manuscript to movement. No longer just read, it was reenacted. In small towns, nuns staged passion plays that ended not with Christ's crucifixion, but with the death of a pregnant sister at the hands of masked priests. In Bruges, a group of anchoresses, women walled into cells for life, scratched verses from the text into their bricks, where pilgrims could read them through the cracks. And in Venice, a guild of midwives began leaving rosemary and folded scraps of vellum on church steps during every Lent. Always the same 3 words. She did not sin. One cardinal, flustered and red-faced, called the movement uterine rebellion. Another, more poetic, named it the bleeding hymn. But no matter what they called it, the church faced a dilemma it could not preach away. It was women, now, who told the story. And they told it better than any priest ever could. One of the most curious examples survives in a private diary, a small book of pressed flowers and looping script kept by a cloistered nun named Sister Benedetta of Assisi. She was born to a noble family, given to God at age 11, kept behind stone and silence for 30 years. And yet in her diary she wrote, "I have never bled but I dream it. Not for want of sin, but for lack of love. And when I think of Sister Vida, I weep not for her death, but for the idea that no one said her name aloud." Sister Benedetta had never read the book. She had heard it, whispered by a laundress who had overheard a midwife who had once nursed a child left at the gate of San Gennaro. It was memory by proxy, and somehow more faithful than any creed. Now let us descend. Not metaphorically, physically. Beneath the Basilica of St. Praxedes in Rome, there is a crypt no longer open to the public. The records say it was sealed after a collapse in 1481. But in 1976, during a minor restoration, workers found something odd behind the broken mortar. A wall of bones. Not unusual for a crypt. But every skull had been cut. Not broken. Not crushed. Sliced, with precision, as if by someone performing a holy ritual with a surgeon's blade. And behind that wall, buried in a lead-lined niche, they found a box. Inside it, a rusted rosary, a shroud stained dark, and a single sheet of parchment bearing only this. They sang Ave Maria, and still they died. The Vatican called it a curiosity, a relic, a mistake. But the workers who found it stopped attending Mass. 2 left the country. 1 joined a Carmelite order and never spoke again. Whatever they saw, whatever they felt, it made believers of them in a way no gospel could. But the most daring chapter in this history belongs to one Sister Matea of Naples. She was born in 1492, the same year Columbus set sail into the unknown, though what she discovered was far older and more terrifying than any ocean. Matea was an archivist, trained in the papal system to classify, categorize, conceal. But she was also a daughter. Her grandmother, as a girl, had witnessed a nun dragged by her hair through a chapel, her belly round, her voice silent. The story passed down like a candle flame cupped between shaking hands. Matea, quiet and clever, began making copies of the forbidden book. She added footnotes, dates, even attempted cross-referencing the missing convent burial records with the papal decrees. And when she was finished, she did not hide it. She sent 1 copy to the Pope himself. No name. No threat. Just a quote, written in crimson ink on the cover. "There is no gospel without blood." The response came not in words, but fire. The convent of San Biagio burned to the ground within days. Officially, a lightning strike. Unofficially, a purge. But Matea survived. They never found her. Only her books. Hidden in crypts. Sewn into altar cloths. Smuggled into the bindings of hymnals. One even turned up centuries later, repurposed as the cover of a theology textbook in Salamanca. Inside, a note. "If they bury us, let them know we were seeds." By the turn of the 16th century, the story had bled out of the convent walls and into the bloodstream of Europe itself. It became part of folk medicine, of lullabies, of prayers whispered not to saints, but to the women who had died without graves. And when the Reformation came, tearing the church apart from the inside out, Martin Luther's own wife, Katharina von Bora, once a nun, was said to keep a tattered page of the womb and the sword tucked into her prayer book. She never quoted it. She never admitted it. But when asked why she left the church, she replied, "Because I could no longer kneel beside ghosts." And now, centuries later, a question remains. Why does this story still burn? Why do pregnant nuns, bleeding in silence beneath rosemary bushes, echo louder than armies, popes, or kings? Because they were never meant to be remembered. Because every whisper of them is a defiance against the vast machinery that tried to grind them into dust. Because the womb, when silenced, becomes not just a chamber of life, but of revenge. And because sometimes the softest voices, those that never got to scream, are the ones that rise the highest in the end. By the dawn of the 17th century, the world had turned on many axes. The Renaissance painted the skies with color and curiosity, and yet, in the shadowed corners of Europe, the echoes of those silenced nuns still whispered. Like ghosts in the cathedral stone, they lingered, not bound by time, nor by the decrees of any pope. Their stories, woven into the very fabric of European conscience, had become a silent testament to suffering, power, and the unbearable weight of secrets. It was a world more aware, yet still blind to certain truths. The church had transformed, but its walls remained thick with the same fears of women's bodies, of their autonomy, of the power hidden beneath cloistered habits. Pregnant nuns were no longer openly dismembered, but the legacy of silence, the scars of complicity, were etched deep into the holy orders. Into the families who whispered prayers for the daughters they never fully understood. Across small villages and bustling cities, the tale persisted. Passed down in hushed tones between midwives, embedded in the mournful refrains of folk songs, and concealed within the margins of forbidden texts. The women who carried these stories did not always speak their names aloud. Sometimes they dared not, but their defiance was etched in every act of rebellion, in every refusal to bow to imposed shame. Isabeau's lineage, scattered in secret, blossomed in ways unseen. Her legacy was not only in the words she had written or the names she had restored, but in the courage she planted like a seed beneath centuries of neglect. It grew wild and unruly, beyond the reach of even the most powerful to prune or suppress. By this time, the Papal States no longer held the uncontested power of old, but the shadow of that power reached still, like a long, gnarled finger pointing toward the past, and warning against remembrance. Yet the more they tried to erase, the stronger the roots grew, weaving through convent walls and beyond, touching hearts and minds. In quiet corners, in monasteries where candles burned late into the night, the forbidden manuscripts found their way onto new shelves. Scholars, skeptics, believers, and revolutionaries alike drew strength from the stories of those who had died unheard, unseen. They saw in these tales a mirror, one that reflected not just the cruelty of a past pope, but the resilience of those who refused to be broken. History, as it often does, was not kind to the powerful who sought to control it. The pope who ordered those brutal silences died a fearful, lonely man, haunted by the very secrets he tried to bury. But the nuns, the daughters, the midwives, their spirits lived on in the wind that carries rosemary scents across the French countryside, in the trembling hands of those who dared to speak, and in the collective memory of a world that slowly, painfully, learns to listen. And so, dear listener, as we close this chapter, Imagine the quiet rustling of pages in a dimly lit room, the soft hum of prayers that are no longer whispered in shame but sung aloud with strength, the enduring pulse of lives once hidden beneath centuries of silence. Because sometimes, the loudest revolution is the one written not with swords, but with the unyielding ink of remembrance. Let us linger now in this moment of calm, where the weight of centuries slowly lifts like morning mist from a still lake. The story has unfolded like a tapestry, threads woven with pain, courage, and the fragile hope that truth might one day bloom amid ruins. The echoes of those lost voices, once swallowed by shadows, now rise gently like a hymn carried on soft winds through ancient stone corridors. It is here, in the quiet aftermath, that we find a strange peace, not because the past has been made right, but because remembrance itself is an act of grace. The sharp edges of history soften, and we see not just the cruelty of power, but the unbreakable spirit of those who, despite it all, held fast to life and hope. May we carry their stories with us, tender and fierce, as a reminder that even in the darkest nights, the faintest light can guide us toward dawn. And may the whispers of rosemary and prayer, sung through centuries, continue to remind us that silence is never truly silence when it is born of defiance.